Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is with Michigan State professor and Niskanen Center senior fellow Matt Grossmann. He has a new book out. It's called Polarized by Degrees. The book is all about the idea that culture wars and the Diploma Divide have realigned American politics, changing the left and the right's approach to sociocultural and economic questions since the 1980s. I think this topic is at the very center of the political realignment, so this is a great episode to bone up on everything that's determining the course of the next few years. Hope you all enjoy the conversation, and a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Matt Grossmann, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
I'm really pumped to speak with you. We're going to hit political realignment, the Diploma Divide, and of course, the ever-present culture war. So let's just start by defining academic and political concepts that get thrown around a lot, but I don't think people here explain just coherently what we're actually talking about here. When we are describing an increasing diploma divide in American politics, what are we talking about?
Most of the time, people just mean that college-educated voters are moving towards the Democrats and voters without college education are moving towards the Republicans. It's, of course, concentrated among white voters, and it extends beyond just a college degree or not to things like whether voters go to graduate school, whether they attend elite education, all of those things moving people in a Democratic direction.
I'd love to hear, as an academic, how do you think about the diploma divide conversation? Because the reason why I find it problematic in the shorthand way it's kind of thrown about is it implies that by definition, then, one party is in favor of progress and another party isn't in favor of progress. Therefore, all these actually really nuanced debates about technocracy, expertise, the correct policy decision we should be taking on these different issues are inherently going to favor one side or the other. That's just how I think about it as someone who studies these categories. But how do you think about it as someone who's writing about it deeply?
Well, of course, there's nuanced perspectives on both sides of American political debate, but there is also real polarization around visions of American society. And there has been fundamental changes in who we are as a nation, in what kinds of social norms and how we speak. All of those things have changed fundamentally over the last few decades. So I don't think it's surprising that there would be some people who are less comfortable with those changes and thinking that we're on the way down rather than up. Of course, that doesn't mean they want no policy changes or that none of their proposals are informed by expertise, but there has been a big shift where Democrats are increasingly deferential to experts of all kinds, while Republicans are more skeptical. And there's reason for that, because the experts are from this college-educated class that's moving leftward.
So let's understand this then. We should always start by pointing out that Ronald Reagan actually won those with bachelor degrees, the college-educated vote. And I think it's easy, because so many of our culture wars are rooted in the 60s and 70s, to basically say, why would this dynamic inherently change? There are plenty of, in fact, bigger debates around who we are as a country, social values, economic values. Why is there something unique about this realignment of college-educated voters during the early 21st century in comparison to the 1980s?
Well, it does go back a long way, and it is, we usually think about it as a growing divide now, but as you said, first there had to be the flip before there was the growing divide. And so college-educated voters who were richer on average tended to vote more with the right. And it isn't something that's exclusive to the United States. All over the democratic world, there has been a shift where the old class divide based on income has been slowly replaced by a class divide based on education. That's associated with the shift in our politics away from the traditional economic redistributive dimension towards this social and cultural issue dimension. But there has also been a sort of expansion of a debate that started in elite corners and made its way to the public. So conservatives were always skeptical of universities, of movements that originated on campus. But, college-educated voters and Republican voters used to trust newspapers more. They used to trust institutions of all kinds. They weren't necessarily skeptical in the same way that conservative elites were telling them to be until all of these issues came to the fore, and they repeatedly saw these institutions seem to take the side of liberals in these culture war debates.
So it's interesting. If I'm hearing you correctly, are you arguing or stating here that if you're thinking about the fact that Reagan won college-educated voters of the 1980s, we should think of that as an economic phenomenon versus the phenomenon today being much more about sociocultural values?
There has definitely been not a replacement, but just a extension of political conflict from economic issues to social and cultural issues. And the more that people vote on those social and cultural issues, the more these divides based on college education become prominent. And I think it's useful to say that we're not alone, that this is happening all over the world to the left and the right. What's unique about the United States is that the movements associated with lower education voters like populism, anti-immigration, find their way into third parties in most countries. But in the United States, they have to be in the Republican Party. And similarly, movements that might make for a Green Party or a Liberal Party elsewhere in the world have to be within the Democratic Party. But it is associated with those social cultural values coming to the fore. But there also has been change. We have been moving leftward on these cultural values since the 1980s. It's especially pronounced in areas like drug policy and gay rights. But you see it, pretty much across the social issue spectrum. And so conservatives are right to perceive that they are sort of losing these battles over time. And even if you thought of yourself as progressive in the 1980s, it might not be that way today.
Does something happen within college at an undergrad level or grad school at a graduate level that convinces people or self-selects people into a more left-leaning sociocultural POV? Or is this just a selection bias thing in the first place?
It's all of the above. So there is some causal evidence that going to college changes people's political views, especially on social and cultural issues, and moves them leftward. To the extent that we know, it seems to be from peer groups rather than from professor indoctrination. But there is some of it that happens at college. On the other hand, the kinds of changes that we are seeing, like in the 2016 election, people who had or had not gone to college 40 years ago shifted their political allegiance. So that wasn't due to change in college. That was due to how their attitudes mapped onto the current political terrain. The other thing is there's all kinds of self-reinforcement afterwards. So yes, there's now selection in going to college. People who go to college are more likely to have these cultural values. But then once you leave college, you tend to be in professions, in geographic areas, in social networks that all reinforce those social cultural values that are more prominent among the educated. And it turns out that both matter. So your individual education matters, but so is if you live in a college town versus a rural community without a whole lot of college graduates. That also influences your politics and your outlook on social change.
I'm curious. So if we're looking at the early 20th century, one of the big developments obviously is high school attendance and graduation becomes normalized in the same way that attending university becomes normalized post 1960s. It's becoming much more of a mass phenomenon than just sort of like a niche elite phenomenon. Do you have any research or knowledge on whether or not going to high school and completing it had a similar effect on the country's sociopolitical makeup?
Well, at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of political affiliation associated with that completion, but that doesn't mean that it, on a partisan basis, but that doesn't mean that it had no effects. It did have political effects on what kinds of issues we discussed. But as you're pointing out, this is a very long-term pattern of increased educational attainment. I think what people just may not realize is that college-educated voters just used to be a much smaller constituency and one that was known to be niche. People didn't necessarily expect the opinions and views of college-educated voters to be reflected in either of the political parties just because they weren't a very dominant voting constituency. So that's pretty recent. But yes, there have always been effects of education on political views, but we're in kind of a unique moment where those effects are aligned with the way that parties, and especially the left and the right globally, are now presenting themselves.
The second term that's obviously referenced in the book title, but we should define here specifically, is what are and how do you conceptualize the culture wars?
So this it is admittedly a little bit difficult because some things that don't initially get considered culture war issues end up becoming a part of the culture war. Healthcare, for example, being a big example of that. But we empirically we sort of define it in both ways. We say that if you just define culture war issues based on things that were considered parts of cultural and social conflict at the time when they came into the political debate, and you don't update things for how they eventually came, then you still see the Democratic and Republican parties talking more about those issues over time, and you see the divisions in voting more often reflecting people's views on those perennially social issues, things like abortion, like the role of the family, like gay rights. But we still think that it's an important part of the story that more and more things get swept up as part of the culture war and become defined as cultural issues. And it's hard for any economic policy to be advanced that doesn't tend to hit people's culture war buttons as well.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how even college attendance in of itself has just become a culture war issue. So, for example, if we're thinking to our most 1990s generic think tank articulation of how America could win the 21st century, build the bridge out of the 20th, we're going to say, hey, like we're going to have people go to college, we're going to work on community college, we're going to do all these different things. That statement is clearly a political statement in a way that it wasn't in the 1990s. How do you think about that overall dynamic in terms of how college attendance, which you could easily put through the frame of just being, hey, if we needed people to go from an 8th grade education to a 12th grade education, now we're going to have another 4 years, that should be framed or could be framed as an economic policy. I think it's a largely economic phenomenon that relates to the end of the farm and then urbanization in the 20th century, but it isn't anymore today. You see this with Mike Rowe and the dirty jobs, everything like that. How do you think about this sort of shift from college, from this purely economic, you're here to sort of invest in your future dynamic, to this clearly politically charged phenomenon?
Yeah, and policymakers used to treat it that way as well. This used to be primarily a state policy issue about, accountability for tuition increases, about aligning college graduates with the state's job market. It didn't tend to be about, professor indoctrination and students are too liberal and some people shouldn't go to college. That usually was not the attitude of most political officials on either side. So it has transitioned as there has been a real shift in the alignment of those institutions on the liberal side of the culture war. So, a big part of our story is that conservatives are not imagining that these institutions, including universities, the media, even business, have become more culturally liberal over time as they have become dominated by college-educated and highly educated people. Those are real trends that people are seeing and reacting to. But it is a the reaction only goes so far in that social institutions tend to be quite dominated by the educated. In politics, 95% of the House and Senate are college educated. We do have people railing against college, but some of them went to Ivy League institutions, and we're kind of in that milieu all along. Similarly, the leaders of our nonprofits, of our media, of pretty much any social institution you can think about are increasingly educated over time, and thus are increasingly socially, culturally liberal in their expressed and unexpressed viewpoints.
How do you think institutions that tend to be very meritocratic in the sense of like their leaders went to the right schools and passed the right tests, and then also are very much based upon expertise, how do you think they have fared at navigating this new political environment? Because I'll just say, like, my bias outright, I think they have done a horrible job of doing so. I'm curious how you think about this now that I've thrown my bias in your face.
I'll just say it's a hard thing to do. If you see yourself as being an unbiased institution to try to bring, empirical details to the public conversation, or to try to teach general skills, and that ends up being perceived as one side of the political debate, it's sort of hard to come back from that. That doesn't mean we can't do anything better, but it does mean it's a hard thing. Part of my role at Michigan State University is that I'm the director of a center where we see the newly elected state legislators in their first orientation. We train potential political candidates in a program that's half Democrats and half Republicans. So I'm kind of repeatedly on the front lines of trying to say what we can contribute in terms of institutions to the political debate in a way that has value for both sides. But it is, going to be increasingly hard over time. Now, that doesn't mean that the institutions have done everything correctly, but there is a trade-off. So one of the things that's come up recently that we address is, what to do about Donald Trump. Lots of scholars perceive that he is similar to authoritarian leaders in other countries, that American democracy is going through warning signs that are similar to what has been transparently poor for democratic systems elsewhere. So should they speak up? Of course. But in speaking up, they are taking one side of the dominant political debate. It's really hard to be taken seriously by the right if you're, on record saying one side is trampling on democracy and the other isn't. If that's what you think from, your study of democratic political systems elsewhere, it's hard to tell you not to do that, though. So I think it's a real challenge.
And the Trump example is a great one because I think given, especially if you're a historian who studies like that topic area, I understand why you fall into that. I'd be curious, though, how you think other experts, how they intersect in these public policy areas. So, for example, like not to just relitigate COVID in an unhelpful way, I do think a really interesting takeaway from COVID, especially with the school closure debate is, listen, I think expertise is here is COVID. Here's our best informed perception of what spread looks like, mortality rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's when you get into debates around school closure, which are ultimately about values and risk tolerance and weighing costs and benefits within different groups. So like, once again, a teachers union, when you have different effects of mortality between young people and older people, are going to have different perspectives on that question than, let's say, parents or school-age children. How do you think experts should understand the limits of expertise when it comes to answering policy questions in a politically divided society?
Yeah, we do relitigate COVID in the book, and we think it's fine to go back through these policy debates because, as you say, expertise is going to involve both, real knowledge more than other people, but also values that might be different, and also interests that might be different. And it's, no wonder that people suspect that college professors or public health officials or anyone that is an expert in a policy debate might have interests and might have values that are intervening on their positions in addition to their knowledge and expertise. And obviously that did happen during COVID. Some of the most prominent examples are about the relative positions that the public health community took on anti-lockdown protests versus the Black Lives Matter protests, the continuing implementation of procedures around surfaces and cleaning surfaces long after we knew that that wasn't a primary means of transmission. Then the school closure debates, absolutely. So there's plenty of examples for conservatives to point to of expertise that combines knowledge with values and interests in a way that benefits one side. And it's no wonder that they do point to that, and that does raise their suspicions. And we point out somewhat similar examples in higher education and the climate change debate. But none of that means that there wasn't value to hearing from experts and following some of their recommendations when it comes to all three of those issues.
I'm really curious to go back to your example of interacting with Democrats and Republicans, these budding politicians. How do you see them responding to the costs, benefits, and limits of expertise and empiricism in a populist era? I'd be really curious, what their personal reaction tends to be, because this seems to be, if I'm putting myself in their shoes, this is the big issue across basically anyone we could basically name here that was particularly contentious.
Yeah, well, first, among policymakers, it's also difficult, in terms of people who testify at congressional committees or are brought in to try to advise legislators. It's still overwhelmingly traditional experts and people who have very high degrees of education. So if you are increasingly skeptical of those people and your constituents are increasingly skeptical of those people, it's sort of hard to know what to do in a policy system that is still dominated by experts. And one of the things that we point out is just that almost any issue now involves a lot of expertise. We have a long history of policy that people have to already know. We have a whole set of institutions that are overlapping that require some degree of expertise. Even in seemingly moral issues like guns or abortion, there's still a lot to know. And so it means that it's sort of hard to get out of this arena of feelings about expertise. In terms of young people, we don't get a representative sample because we get the people who want additional education on both sides. But I would say people don't come in with kind of a unwillingness to hear other views. They want to hear other views. They want to hear the best version of other views that they can. But they're still caught between constituents that may not agree with hearing from the other side, and a political system that has two large sides, and on which most experts are affiliated with one of those sides. It's hard not to notice that as you're hearing from lots of experts.
The other related phenomenon that you're discussing in the book, obviously, is the fact that a part of this modern culture war has been the hyper-politicization of everything. So what makes this conversation difficult, and you point this out in the introduction, is that you'll see Disney, which, if we're talking about the 1990s, you could isolate that from the political system in a bunch of different ways, but it clearly isn't now today. Describe that side of the phenomenon we've clearly seen. And this was also amplified during 2020, during BLM, obviously, when corporations are taking, and this is, I think, my sympathy to corporate PR and governance folks who thought, okay, BLM, George Floyd, this is this momentarily consensus period. You have Mitt Romney walking through BLM Plaza. You have Sean Hannity saying different things in favor of the movement initially. But then within 2 or 3 weeks, it polarizes again in very, very opposite directions. That's a very difficult place for a corporation or an NGO to navigate. Talk about this phenomenon.
Absolutely. So these other social institutions are now in similar place that media and universities have been in, where they think that they are just, observing the nation's increased diversity and going with basic social norms that are changing over time. But that puts them in the middle of culture war debates on which people have strong feelings and aren't their main or organizational reason for being. Those trends that you mentioned, of course, did happen. We still think that there's what we call thermostatic politics, which means that, under Trump, these trends were at their height. Then under Biden, you see a little bit of a pushback on the conservative side of these trends. But if Trump returns, that means that you should expect these kinds of liberalizing social trends to continue in the direction that they were under Trump before. So that puts these institutions in a difficult place in terms of trying not to take a side and yet respond to the demands of their employees, of their customers. That is going to be difficult. I think what we might add is that there still is a liberalizing trend over time. So, if you look at what happened with racial attitudes, a lot of what happened is that liberals moved further leftward on those issues, and conservatives moved much more slowly on those issues. Then, when you saw a pushback, it was a pushback compared to the heightened levels of concern that all voters had. But we did not necessarily retrench from our increasingly liberal racial attitudes as a whole.
A way you sum up the realignment of American politics in the first chapter is you basically articulate that the modern Democratic Party's coalition is led by technocratic, expertise-friendly individuals and institutions. And then on the right, you then see this populist, anti-expertise cohort and coalition on the right. If American politics is trending in one direction, what are the chances that a populist, right-leaning, anti-expertise coalition could actually win out, reverse, stop progress, et cetera?
Well, so yes, there has been huge change in the Democratic coalition. I think people, have heard a lot about changes in the Republican Party under Trump. And so it just may be surprising just to see that the electoral coalition of the Democratic Party, in the 1990s was half white voters without college degrees. And now it's under a quarter. And there are more of the Democratic Party. And now college-educated white voters outnumber white voters without college degrees in the Democratic Party. And of course, racial minorities are an increasing proportion of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, actually, the coalition looks pretty stable because the country is changing. It's becoming more diverse and more educated. So another way of putting this is that as the nation is changing, the Democratic Party is absorbing all of that change, and the Republican Party is kind of staying the same by winning increasing proportions of the older constituencies. So is that a winning formula? Well, there's constant predictions that it isn't, that we're on the road to democratic politics, but they haven't been borne out. And one reason is that we would say is that cultural conservatism does not necessarily need to be about any particular issues. There are always going to be people who feel that things are moving too fast, that they are being left out, that one new step is the step too far, regardless of if the issues change. So there might be people who 10 years ago thought that gay marriage was a big problem, don't anymore, have come to accept that, but are now worried about some extension of transgender rights. And if that issue is resolved, they will find something else that is the step too far in the new era. So that's one reason why you can still have a successful cultural conservatism without necessarily meaning that they win on those issues. But the other reason is that the Democratic Party is moving. The Democratic Party is moving leftward on these issues. So people who did not previously see themselves on the right now might, by virtue of a moving Democratic Party, say that they're on the side of people who think things have now gone too far.
Something I'm curious about, and I want to speak to the non-political institutions like Disney, the NFL, et cetera. Disney obviously has claims over wokeness in its cultural products. The NFL has the Colin Kaepernick protests in the 2010s over the national anthem. It seems like the easy response from a leadership perspective is institutional neutrality. I don't know if you saw this, but Brian Armstrong is the CEO and co-founder of Coinbase, which is a major cryptocurrency platform. And he wrote a big piece in 2021 that really sort of got a lot of attention in the tech community, where it was called Mission Focused Company. And the point of the piece was basically like, look, at the end of the day, there's always different sociocultural things going on in this country. But at Coinbase, you are here to build the best possible. I'm not trying to do Coinbase propaganda here. I don't use Coinbase, being clear here. But you're trying to build the best possible cryptocurrency platform. That's all we focus on. So we're not going to take a statement on BLM. We're not going to take a statement on Trump. We're not going to have affinity groups in our Slack channel. We're just going to actually build. And I think it would be easy to say, hey, that seems to have worked in tech, where you're building software where the product isn't quite necessarily having a political valence. That seems so much harder within a company like Disney, where it's not just what's the mission, for example. Is the mission creating cultural products that like speak to people? The artists have perspectives, the customers have perspective. Within the NFL, for example, at the end of the day, yes, it's true that there are more of a decent majority of NFL fans who just want to watch football and don't like things getting political, but the individual athletes have their own opinions, and they also, in a hyper individualistic United States, want to be able to express their opinions as well too. So the like just focus and dribble thing doesn't seem to work as well in all institutions or private companies. How do you think about this awkward dynamic, which I know everyone and their cousin is trying to think through right now?
We have sympathy for, all different kinds of approaches to this, because we think it's a hard problem. But it doesn't take too much to get involved in a culture war. All that happened with Bud Light was that they, one among many influencers that they hired, became an example that the right didn't like. And it was the beginning of a boycott and a change to the image of a very large company. So, it's hard for anyone to kind of say that they are stepping out of it. There are also internal pressures. Obviously, if your employees say this is a policy in Florida that's going to affect whether we can live there, then that's going to affect your company. And it's going to be hard to not take a position on that issue. Similarly, customers make demands and are different across companies. And to the extent that we can follow a company PR, for example, it does follow what the employees' political views, the customers' political views, the geographic area's political views of where they are founded. So that sort of means that companies are going to be in different spots depending on what their employees look like, their customers look like, and where they're located geographically. But it's going to be a hard problem across the board. One thing that we would just point out about this cultural change is there really is a shift in how conservatives and liberals talk about this. Conservatives really used to say, well, there are these fringe actors who are trying to undermine traditional American values and institutions, and we should stop them from doing that. And that's not how they talk anymore. They talk about hegemonic discourse from major institutions, and it's the left who is defending these institutions from being attacked by the right. And this is not the left of old that would not have found itself necessarily on the side of the New York Times or Harvard University. That isn't how the left or the right used to relate. But we think it is because there really has been a shift. There really has been a elite class that is overwhelmingly college educated, that holds different values than other people in the society.
I like you noting that this isn't the left or right of old, because I think too often there's a style of, and you tend to see this rhetoric from, let's say, centrists who are going to the right, or former leftists of the 60s era who've gone to the right as well too, where they basically say, well, the left of my day was against the administration, or the left of my day thought the New York Times and the FBI and these governmental institutions were the enemy, and everything changed, and it's so hypocritical when the issue set's different, right? Like if the university let's say if Harvard University has a ROTC department in the 1960s, and the issue that's defining the, let's say, like aspirant, upper middle class, yuppie, future yuppie cohort is the Vietnam War, it's not a shocker that by definition, the left of that time would see itself as being anti-administration. By contrast, you'd see the right of the time being not pro-administration because you have Ronald Reagan versus the University of California, Berkeley, but you get the general gist of it. The issue set has just changed. So should we basically, so here's a question then. If the issue set determines how left and right approach which institutions they trust or which movements they support, what inherently exists when we're describing the left and right? Because another thing I hate when people do now is they basically say something along the lines, left and right. These are the realignment pitches I get that I tend to decline because they're kind of dumb, but left and right don't mean anything anymore. Look at how they're so different from what they used to be. I still think there is a left and a right. How do you think about the dynamic, even if the issue sets have changed?
Yeah, I mean, you just look around the world and you find that politics tends to divide along somewhat similar lines. We have always had some kind of redistributive dimension to democratic politics for a long time. And we have a rising social cultural dimension to politics for a long time. I think what people mean when they say that is there's nothing necessarily inherently, holding together my position on abortion and tax policy. And they weren't aligned 40 years ago. They were completely unaligned. So that is true. There's nothing kind of philosophically that has to hold those things together. But that's very different than saying that the left and the right don't structure our politics and we don't know which one is left and right, because it's the same all over the world. And it is, people have very clear impressions of the political parties now in a way that they didn't before. So I think there clearly are. That doesn't mean that there's not hypocrisy on both sides, but it does mean that voters get clear images of the parties. And what we're adding is that those images are increasingly about their positions on social cultural issues. But one other point I would make is that it's not just that the issue set is kind of moving in a random walk. What we're seeing is a liberalizing of cultural attitudes, and some of it isn't really policy, right? So, if network television becomes more diverse in both cultural terms and in acceptance of alternative lifestyles, in the way that it speaks, that's not a change in policy, but it's something that a lot of people recognize. Some people see it as progress, and some people see it as not the direction that they want to see the country go in. And we think people are politically responding to all of these things, not just actual policy change, which also has moved leftward in cultural policy, but the sort of vision of society. And one reason that we're skeptical of these claims that, maybe some institutions will be the right-wing institutions, is because you are seeing conservative critiques of things like the military and the law enforcement agencies and mainstream churches, because all of these institutions are also becoming increasingly dominated by college-educated people with more liberal cultural attitudes than others within their institutions. And that's going to mean that they make the same kinds of statements and get the same attacks that other institutions do.
I want to interrogate the nature of and meaning behind the word progress. So this is a slightly dated reference, which was invalidated by Time. But I remember there's this 2008 episode of 30 Rock where Jenna Maroney makes reference to there not being a new white Disney princess since Belle in the early 90s. And obviously you had Tangled and then Frozen, so that's no longer an issue, quote unquote. But it was true that there was this 18-year period where you did just have minority Disney princesses. So you could look at that phenomenon and say, hey, the country's diversifying, things are changing. This is how things tend to go. And therefore people who object to that in a very if I was I'm ticked off about Mulan and Pocahontas, where's my white princess? That would be very weird and justifiably so. But that phenomenon of increasing number of POC Disney princesses, that is an affirmative choice by Disney, the corporation. They are deciding which stories to tell. They are deciding which areas to prioritize. So how should we, so I'm basically asking is, I suspect progress, quote unquote, is less organic than people on the left claim it is. And that's what I think makes these issues very, very, very difficult and hard to sort of think through. How do you think through the kind of dynamic I'm raising here?
Yeah. So, as we've been talking about, the left is kind of absorbing all of the social change in society. And that means it's going to be sort of over reflected or reflected more quickly than it is in society as a whole. And that means that these social institutions that are composed of college educated liberals are going to, in some ways, be the leading edge of these kind of social and cultural changes. To them, as you said, it just looks like they're just reflecting society. If they didn't do that, then it would mean that they were actively ignorant of social change. But to conservatives, they are helping to convince people that this kind of social change is good. We should welcome it. It is in line with traditional American values and institutions, and they see that as a threat. Both things are true. They both are reflecting real change. They are also helping to lead that real change by affirming it and by making it a more visible part of our culture.
I like your use of the word lead the change, because I think if you're just at a self-awareness perspective, if you are aware of the fact that you are not, let me put it this way, I think a lot of leaders of institutions that are increasingly left-leaning would be in a better place to respond to controversies if they were aware of that dynamic in of itself, which I think is very, very, very helpful. So in this last section, a couple big questions. So number one, as you said, this is a worldwide phenomenon. Are there any countries or governmental systems that you've come across that seem to be navigating this dynamic, this potential spiral that this continues on forever for the rest of the century better than others?
Well, I think in general, multi-party systems are navigating it quite differently. That does not necessarily mean it's all better, but certainly, if there is an outlet for anti-immigrant, anti-institutional sentiment that can be shown to have political representation but not be a majority in society, then it can be left to the side while it's being expressed, and we're seeing that in several European countries. But similarly, if you have a college-educated left that prioritizes environmental issues, higher education, but does not necessarily prioritize traditional redistribution or social insurance programs, then it also might not reach a majority within any party. But all of those systems are also seeing increasing fragmentation because the centrist parties do not necessarily represent the rising constituencies on either side. So it's a challenge for all political systems. But what's unique about ours is everything gets channeled into these two major political parties. And that means that we're more polarized. It means that, everything is a more vitriolic conversation. It means that social institutions have a very difficult time not taking a side in the political debate. And those are more pronounced problems in the United States than elsewhere.
Do you have a theory of the case for how and why culture wars end? Because it seems like the obvious thing to say would be, we need some sort of cultural settlement between these different competing factions. But the issue is, especially given the fact that the two parties are no longer as strong as they were, we can't have a situation where the Democrats and the Republicans come together and say, this is the great trans compromise of 2025. This is the great immigration compromise of 2025. You have governors. You have, let's be clear, if there was some sort of like right-leaning immigration compromise, you're going to see some mayor or governor of a blue state push out in a left-wing direction, which would then get them more. So you basically, there's a game theory problem here. It seems near impossible to actually create a true settlement. So do these just sort of burn themselves out rather than just truly settle? Like, how do you think about that?
Well, unfortunately, some of our comparative friends believe that they end in bad ways. They end in violence in lots of places or changes to a regime. So that's why they're worried, because they tend to get more vitriolic over time rather than less so. I think we see a little bit more room for compromise. There are things that just engulf the political system as a whole. Everyone moved rightward on criminal justice policy across states, across parties, and then everyone moved leftward on criminal justice policy across states, across parties. So to some extent, you could say that we have reached more of a truce on some of these matters than in the past. The left also sometimes wins some of these cultural battles, and so then they just don't rise to prominence very much anymore. So pornography, for example, is an issue that used to be a big part of right-wing resistance that just doesn't come up very much anymore. So I think.
Oh, actually, quick pushback on the porn thing. Porn is actually fascinating though, because I'm sure you've seen this, but you know of this. Red states are now doing the ID verification policy, which has shut down major porn sites in red states because they say you have to be like 18 and put in your ID, and sites like Pornhub don't want to comply. So it's been this like really interesting niche area of conservatives actually wielding the power of the state to notch big culture, sociocultural wins. And it seems to me the big problem here for the right is that like it's very hard outside of that specific category because what they're doing is it was already illegal for people under 18 to consume porn. So it's not like they needed to fight and win that battle. They're just adding a technocratic little log jam on top of it that no company wants to comply with. But it's just like an interesting, like, this is a little side story. I have some friends in the Texas AG's office where Texas sort of pioneered this policy. And this is seen as like a big win there, but it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, the cultural conservatives, have trouble kind of coming up with policy wins. And so, there's some innovation in those areas. But I don't think I think we should recognize the shift. In the 1980s, there was even, there were congressional hearings over song lyrics where both parties got together to condemn the music industry. That's just not an issue anymore. There were all kinds of controversies about art and things that were considered pornographic by the right that have been accepted. That doesn't mean that they're not going to come up with new issues. And this is what I was going to say in response to your other concern is, will the culture wars end? Well, some of them will, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be new things that people who are concerned that the country is changing too fast, that we're undermining traditional values aren't going to find as the things that move too far. And I do think because we're in a society where it's quite easy to find examples of the other side going too far, that it's going to be sort of hard to shut that down. So, if you listen to Rush Limbaugh in the 1990s, a lot of it was finding crazy examples of things happening on campuses or things objectionable in the media. But those you still have to go out and find those things. Now, there's can be whole shows dedicated to hundreds of these things a day, and so it's going to be hard to kind of shut that down. The outrage machine is easy to run these days.
So, last two questions. Number one, some of my most radical and actually problematic sense of my conservative friends are just totally, they would agree with every single thing you just said. And it's led them to a state of despair. Basically, like the country's inextricably moving to the left. Sometimes there's overreach, like during 2020 and 2021. And we backpedal a bit. We're still clearly moving in a direction. And I think, once again, we could overstate how much these conservatives matter. But, that leads to anti-democratic feeling. That leads to like winner take all politics. That leads to January 6th type stuff, like unironically so. Why play by the rules if we are always going to end up losing? What words of solace do you have for the good faith members of the right? Because there are plenty of bad faith people who are doing that for clicks. What solace do you have to just sort of like normal everyday people on the right who are responding to this leftward shift with despair and defeat? What do you say to those people?
Well, the project of kind of rolling back social changes that have already occurred is not a very successful one. So if that is what people are interested in, it's going to be hard to achieve, and I think we should be open to that.
I should not have come to an empirical political. I should not have come to a political scientist for those words of solace.
But look, conservatives have a real role in trying to point out that liberals are always proposing new things, and that some of them, need more thinking before implementation. They have a role in saying, can we slow down social change to allow society to adapt to the changes that have already occurred? And that role is longstanding. And so that doesn't mean that they're going to win in the sense that they're going to start reversing these social changes, but it does mean a real role. And this goes back to the beginning of conservative politics. If you think about, the role of people who had predominant wealth and were agreeing to participate in a democracy, they knew that things were not necessarily going to move in their direction, but they were convinced that part of what the role of politics is to work out how social change occurs. How do we compensate losers? How do we try to make sure that a society can handle the pace of change that is happening around us? That has always been part of the role of conservative politics.
So it seems like the word of warning / solace for the right is reconciling themselves to the fact that in a democracy, you are going to lose sometimes. And that's a reality. That's the trade-off, as long as the rules are fair. What is the word of caution then you would offer the left and left-leaning institutions in an environment like today's, then, given the book you've written?
They are in a difficult place, but I think it starts with recognizing how many battles they have won. And as you said, that they are in some ways leaders of this social and cultural change. And that might mean that they do have to pay attention to the people who are left behind, by the people who feel that society is moving too fast, that these institutions no longer represent them. Does that mean that they have to stop pushing for what they see is progress or basic rights? It doesn't, but it does mean that there are always trade-offs with things like public expression, with getting involved in the political issues of the day. Those trade-offs have been longstanding, but in today's world, where politics is increasingly about everything, it's much easier to step into the middle of a political debate than it has been in the past. And so no one should be surprised that when they think they're just expressing their basic values, that's going to put them on one side of a political debate.
A quick thought I just had. What does everything you just said make you think about the debate over viewpoint diversity and essentially, which is the nice way of saying it, the wrong way of saying it is sort of affirmative action for conservatives within intellectual institutions, especially universities. Is that an affirmative project that should be pursued?
Well, I'm a part of Heterodox Academy and some of the organizations that are trying to at least look into this issue, because there is some evidence that liberals are willing to discriminate against conservative applicants for professorships, that conservative students are deterred from applying to graduate programs. And all of that, I think, should be accepted as a reason to think about changing behavior. Is that going to be enough to change the trajectory of academia? Of course not. This is, we always had selection into academia, and now it's much more tied to politics. And so the idea that we're going to reverse these liberalizing trends in universities is difficult. But we should know that we're not alone in this. There are obviously media companies and nonprofits and even businesses that are having to make the same kinds of judgments. And I think it's awareness is the first step, and I guess an acknowledgement that some of these complaints have their basis in a real change in how these institutions present themselves and who is in them.
So the last actual question here, how much of all of this is about Trump, right? Because as you pointed out, this is a worldwide phenomenon. So we can't literally say it's just Trump. Brexit and the things that led to it were pre-Trump phenomenon. Yet at the same time, it's hard to see a world where Trump goes away and then you see Mitt Romney or Nikki Haley's Republican Party come back. So close there. Like, how much of this is just really coming down to a big individual who clearly has dominated a narrative level political era versus forces that are just beyond any one single person?
Yeah, a lot of these changes were accelerated by Trump, not just the electoral ones, but the changes in how institutions present themselves. We also point out that I think Barack Obama also is an important individual force in helping to bring this about, because he sort of represented the nation's increased diversity and educational attainment in the way that he talked about social change. And sort of changing the image of the Democratic Party. And so both of those figures were important to the changes. But as you say, if we have an international phenomenon that seems to be moving in one direction, it's hard to predict that just with a different Republican candidate, we're gonna get a different result. So. There are certainly individuals that accelerate this, but the big difference in the United States is just that we had a whole set of things that were happening in other parts of the world that were finding fruition in non-mainstream parties that were just kind of being kept to the sidelines in the U.S. And once they were let in, they pretty much changed the images of the major parties to sound more like what are third parties in other nations. And so that's something that's definitely going to be hard to reverse. That doesn't mean people aren't trying. So, the nomination of Joe Biden was an attempt to say, let's speak to blue collar workers. Did it work? Well, he might have slowed the shifts in the electorate, but he also extended Hillary Clinton's gains. Kamala Harris has nominated Tim Walz as a attempt to say, we're going to speak to rural voters. We're going to speak to people who are concerned with the elites on the coasts. So it's not that the parties don't ever try, but it's kind of hard to run against the tide.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me on the Realignment. The book is available in our bookshop if you'd like to learn more.